Hey, internet friends, what if I told you that high quality modes in Ableton, such as you see here on devices, high quality unsaturator, or sometimes called oversampling, like on EQ8, what if I told you that these are sometimes not the best option, and it's got nothing to do with CPU? But multiplier, don't people like you on the internet go around saying things like, by default, I mean, this is all true, by default, these are in lower quality mode. So if you buy Ableton off the internet and you load up a glue compressor, it will by default not be an oversampling and therefore not be in the best quality possible. So people like you are like, multiplier, put it into oversampling and then do save as default preset. People like me do say that because, well, I mean, it's the CPU cost is negligible. It doesn't take almost any CPU, it's not a big deal, and it is scientifically, objectively better quality. So it says high quality here, but oversampling is better quality, and it's on stuff like EQ8 as well. It's also on plugins. For example, let me show you that. Here we have iZotope Trash 2. Hello, iZotope Trash 2. And if you go to options, is it in options? I think it is. Oh, there you go. Fantastic. So oversample algorithms. By default, again, it's turned off, but yet it's better quality. It is literally better quality to oversample things, but why might you not want to use it? Boink. It's to do with something called latency. Bear with me here. So if I go to that EQ8, well, let's use EQ8. So if I right click, we can see currently it's in oversampling mode, so better quality. And if we hover our mouse over the top bit, the top bar bit, we can now see in the bottom left corner, latency 16 samples or 0.36 milliseconds based on the sample rate. So look at the mouse, boing, and there you go. It's now telling us latency. Whoop, it's not telling us now. Boink, and now it's telling us latency. Excellent. And we can do this for each of these devices. So saturator, 4 samples, a tiny, almost no latency. That's almost nothing. And includes saturator's case, 32 samples. Now, multiply what you want about. What's that got to do with anything? It's to do with the default and these oversampling options. So notice at the moment, these are all the oversampling options. I mean, it's called high quality here, but it's really just oversampling. I think it was in Ableton Live 8, EQ8, it said high quality, now it says oversampling. Oversampling is just the technical term for the way in which it's high quality in this case. So let's turn all of these off. So now we're resetting it back to default. So now these are all in normal default mode, i.e. not the highest quality, i.e. not oversampling. Okay, so now look what happens. So if I hover my mouse over the top now, no samples. It's got no latency at all. Latency 0. Saturator latency 0 as well. Mouse, I got overexcited and the mouse moved. Glue compressor, also 0 samples. It may be easier to see if I just sort of do this. There you go. Latency 0 samples. So by default, if we're not oversampling, the latency is 0 samples. Now, I'll explain what that means in a few moments' time and why it's complicated as to why it's important or not. But let me just show you how big this latency can be by just picking plugins, and hopefully, I'm guessing the plugins have a much bigger latency because if I go to something like especially saturator and turn on high quality mode, so remember before high quality, no latency, and with high quality, 4 samples of latency, 0.091 millis. That's so little amount of time that you can basically ignore it. No worries at all. Get on with your life, absolutely fine. And as I said, the CPU cost is negligible in the grand scheme of things, unless you have like a bazillion of these things, and even then it's still basically negligible compared to everything else. However, let's look at Trash 2. So by default, Trash 2, remember, with oversampling off, because by default, oversampling tends to be turned off. Trash 2, latency, 0 samples. Now let's turn on, let's turn on oversampling. So oversampling on for Trash 2. And now let's take a look. Still very small, but that didn't illustrate my point very well at all. But you can see how, so here, 32 samples, slightly bigger, 0.73 milliseconds. Imagine now you had lots of these. It's very conceivable you had maybe, well, if you have a processing chain with 7 or 8 devices, if you start turning oversampling on all of them, it starts to build up. Latency stacks up. So you can imagine if you had 7 or 8 different devices, each with a small to medium amount of latency, it would add up to a much bigger amount of latency. Not to mention there are some plugins that have a lot of latency, as I will show you. Anyway, even though that's currently small at 32 samples, it's not negligible. It's right on the edge of negligible, but it's not completely negligible. Let me show you an example of how extreme latency can get whilst also showing, I've got the wrong keyboard plugged in, whilst also showing you what latency is and why it's important to know about this stuff. Oh, and when it all goes horribly wrong and why by default it's turned off, it will all make sense. I'm piecing things together like a puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle piece. So let's, we've got FabFilter Pro Q2 here. It's the not 3, but it illustrates the point perfectly fine. So by default, as you can see, latency, 0 samples. It even says 0 latency down here. That's your clue. That latency and quality and all that sort of fun stuff are interlinked. So if I go to linear phase, just a different, I won't get into that now, it's a whole 10-minute video by itself. I don't want the help tips. I don't need any help. You need help. FabFilter, no, don't. I love you. FabFilter, you're amazing. Linear phase, so linear phase medium. So consider this, and the amount of linear phase, again, I wish I'd do another video on it maybe. Actually, I can't, I did it all in the course. So anyway, multiplier focus. Whoa, look at that, linear phase medium. Look how much latency that is, that's mad. Over 5,000 samples, but more importantly, in the real world, what does that mean? It means latency of 116.1 milliseconds. That's 0.1 seconds, that's not negligible. 0.1 seconds isn't negligible. Let's take it further though. What happens if we did maximum? Say what? That is mad. Brains exploded. 66,000 million. It's not 66,000. It's just 66,000. 66,000 samples and that's 1.5 seconds. So this is an extreme example, but it illustrates latency. I'll explain that word in 2 minutes time, 30 seconds time, and this illustrates the point. So we'll circle back, don't worry. Focus multiplier. So linear phase max, this is an example of an extremely high latency, 1.5 seconds. That means there'll be 1.5 seconds between the sound entering the plugin and the sound coming out of the plugin. That's what latency means. Latency is that delay between something going in and something coming out, which I can show you. So let me show you that visually with a very high, yeah, let's do that. So linear phase very high. We now have roughly 0.4 seconds of latency, 0.4 seconds of latency, which I can show you visually. So I'm going to copy that, copy like this. In fact, we're to editing. Look at all of these. I've got loads of what I just had in a row. This will show you latency. So the sound will start an operator and then it will move, as you can see through these meters, from one plugin or one instance of the plugin to the next in order, showing visually latency. So watch this. And also keep your eye on this meter, that's what we hear effectively. So the MIDI information starts here to the left of the operator, and then operator makes a sound, and then it goes from thing to thing to thing with about 0.4 seconds of, I'm about to press the button. Mouse, get out of the way. There you go. Boop. Oh, see that happening? It's moving. I've muted it, by the way, so you can't hear anything, but you can see with the meters, it takes time to go from one device to the next. And that time is this latency here. Excellent. That is latency. Latency is the amount of time it takes from the sound to go into the amount of time from it going into a device to the amount of time it goes out of a device. Now, what I really should have said at the beginning of the video is why that matters in Ableton, because that's the advanced final point that ties this all together, because lots of you probably already know that, but don't know why this matters. So take a look at this. This is the Ableton manual that tells you things about how Ableton works. It's the official manual, and it says it. Note that tempo synced effects and other devices that get timing information from Live's internal clock may sound out of sync if they're placed in a device chain after devices which cause delay or latency. Here they're using delay to basically tell you what latency is. This means if you use something after, so let me show you a very practical, words are difficult. Let me show you a very practical example. Let me get Shaperbox, one of my favorite plugins, although ironically I haven't actually put it into favorites. Why haven't I done that? So let's pretend I'm using Shaperbox and say the volume module to do sidechain compression. So I set up a length, so a tempo synced thing, so a length quarter division. So it now does sidechain compression every beat, looking like this. I'm sure you've seen it. LFO tool does a very similar job, but different. You get the idea. It's doing sidechain compression, but importantly, it's doing this based off the internal clock information. It's synced to the grid. Think of it that way. It's synced to the grid. If something syncs to the grid, if it's got a synced time, if something gets the timing information from the grid, which this does because it's sidechaining to the grid division, it'll be out of sync because of what I just showed you in the Ableton manual. So basically, and here's it all pieced together. I've been rambling today, but hopefully this makes some kind of sense, people. Hopefully. Latency is an issue if you have a tempo sync device, such as Shaperbox or LFO tool or something with a LFO or something synced to the grid. Latency is an issue if you have something synced to the grid after that in the processing chain. So here we have a whole bunch of latency. We have a few seconds worth of latency because of all these FabFilter Pro Qs. Therefore, Shaperbox will be out of sync no matter what we do. Oh no, that's bad. Then therefore it's out of sync. Oh no, it's going to be out of sync now. In this case, somewhat ironically, it's not a problem. Let me explain why. Well, it is a problem, but it's a problem that you're here. That's important. So in this case, because we have 0.4, many seconds worth of latency, Shaperbox will be very clearly out of time. If I set up a track here and set up this exact situation where we have a few seconds of latency and then Shaperbox afterwards, I would very clearly hear, hopefully anyway, if I'm not asleep, I would hear that this will now be out of time. And I go, it's out of time. I don't want it to be out of time. Something's gone wrong. Let me investigate. Cool. But what if there's just a small amount of latency, which in reality, if you're using the EQ8 and so on and those sorts of things, it would be. So let me. I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to undelete that. Boom. Okay, let's duplicate. In this situation, it's out of time, but in a subtle way. Remember, there's a tempo sync device after something causing latency, and therefore it'll be out of time. Ableton confirm this in the manual. If you don't believe me, do these tests yourself. In fact, it's a good thing to do just to prove the concept to your brain. So in this case, though, it's going to be out of time, but in a subtle way, in a way I'm likely to miss, especially if I don't have a trained ear for these things, or if I'm not paying attention, or if I'm half asleep. So in this case, we have 3 of these equals 1 millisecond, roughly, doing maths. So we have still not much latency. It's only 2 and a bit seconds worth of latency. That probably wasn't the best example, but to illustrate, you can imagine how this sort of builds up. So in this case, it's still out of time. With these EQ8s, it's still going to be, this sidechain compression is still going to be 2 milliseconds out of time. In that case, it's actually not a big deal, but you can imagine how this could be a big deal if you had a big project with loads of these things, and remember, latency all sort of adds up. Latency becomes an issue if you have a tempo sync device after it in the processing chain. And now let's do the final piece of this puzzle. Whilst yes, technically the oversampling mode in EQ8 is better quality. Technically it is. It is. It's because it's doing the maths and stuff. Audio science, whilst it's technically better, whilst it's technically better quality, in reality, it's extremely hard to hear a difference. In fact, it's hard to almost ever create a difference. I remember for many tutorial courses trying to create an example where you could hear the difference. And you can only really hear a difference when you do extreme EQing, this sort of madness. Maybe you do a bit of bar, and then you do just sort of, where's it gone? Just something like something weird or wacky like that. You can really hear a difference when you're doing extreme EQing at the highest frequencies, and you have an appropriate input source. And even then, it's not always necessarily better, or at least creatively speaking, emotionally, it doesn't necessarily always sound better with oversampling on, even though it technically is. It just sounds a bit different. So, I mean, in reality, it's just you almost never hear a difference. It's so weird. In fact, I don't know really why they put that option in, because you have to do some pretty extreme EQing in the high frequencies, like madness, and then let's make Q, the higher the Q, the more you can hear it. So like that's sort of, here you might start to hear a difference. Let's do a different sort of boom, something like that. If you start doing this sort of nonsense and you're like, boof, I'm doing ridiculous EQing in the highest frequencies, you might start to hear a difference. So in that situation, it's worth trying. In fact, that's just worth knowing in general for EQ. If you are doing mad EQ stuffage at the highest frequency end of the spectrum image, that's when you want to at least consider oversampling. But even then, it's not always better. So it's one of those weird things that is technically high quality, but you basically can't hear the difference. And so considering the potential latency issues, it's probably best, in fact, to leave it turned off. So turn it off and then set oversampling off as the default preset. I reckon indeed. If you don't believe me, run the test for yourself. In fact, just in general, if I tell you things, go, good point, multiplier, but I'm going to prove it to myself. If you don't do that, you run into problems because people can just say things on the internet. So when people say things like me, absorb the information and then question it. Go, is multiplier right? Can you hear a difference? But I mean, because I've just said something right there. This is another important point. Multiplier's just said you can not really hear a difference in almost any situation between oversampling with EQ8 and oversampling off. So, I mean, that's not actually changing the EQ. That's misleading there. It looks different, but that's to do with how it filters above 20K. So actually, that's not why it sounds different. I shouldn't have done that. That's something to investigate, actually. Circle back, multiply, you're rambling. Okay, I'll explain that. So notice how it kind of looks different, oversampling on and off. It's really to do with what oversampling means and how it filters the frequencies above 20K and stuff. It's audio science, can't get into it now, but let's go back to what I was saying. I basically said that in most normal situations, let's say you're doing let's say you do a thing, you're like boof, and then you're like paka, and then you're like, we'll change the cue, maybe do a bit of that. So in a normal situation like this, multiplier just went ahead and said, you can't really hear a difference, or you can't actually hear a difference in almost any situation between oversampling on and oversampling off. Test it for yourself. And if you can't hear a difference, you can't hear a difference. Don't go, or maybe someone with better ears can hear a difference with better headphones. Because even if that was true, chances are you're listening on the same equipment that everybody else is, so it doesn't matter. If only 4 people out of every 200,000 can hear a difference, it's not important. And this doesn't apply to you anyway. Just because, I mean, you're probably not making music for those 4 people out of the 400,000. So test this for yourself. An important principle about listening to people on the internet, such as me, is test things. Obviously, evaluate the strength of their argument and how they say things, but test it. So I reckon, yeah, turn it off. Boom. Same with saturate. Actually, saturators, you can actually hear. It's much easier to hear a difference. Let me. I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes. I saw a rabbit yesterday bouncing around in the field when I went for a walk in the countryside. But we're going down that rabbit hole very quickly. One more point. Don't worry. I'll get there eventually. That's what she said. Saturator. When might you hear the difference for saturator with high quality on versus high quality off? Normally for things like, in fact, let me just show you. So here we have a sine wave. I've muted it, but you can see without distortion, it's a sine wave, a high frequency sine wave. And if I now distort this and turn off and on oversampling this high quality mode, you can see those imperfections. Excellent. What we should see are the harmonics, the multiples of that frequency as we're distorting. But there's all this additional noise, this aliasing stuff, this stuff in between the peaks, which, as you can see, high quality mode reduces, which oversampling mode reduces. In the case of distortion, it's different for EQ. It's worth doing the test to prove it to yourself and also just to help reinforce the concepts and how it works. And even just like the little things such as, how do I make a sine wave? You might already know that, but if you don't know that, that's cool. That's something to have a play with. And yes, multipliers rambling, jibber jabbering to the max. Wow, this video's gone on way longer. This is supposed to be a short video. Oh, wowzers trousers. Wowzers trousers indeed. I will catch you guys on the flippity flip. Wait. I've rambled like a complete maniac in this video. So if you are genuinely curious in a more structured, concise explanation of all this sort of stuff, building up principles one by one, do you see my courses I do on Groove 3? I explain this in much more detail and don't ramble as much. So yeah, knowledge in your brain. Excellent.